My name is Ria Din, and this is my story for Colourful Heritage. My father's name was Nawab Din, and he came to Glasgow from the village of Chichawatney in the district of Sahiwal in Pakistan, and I know this sadly not because I actually visited, but because I used to address all of his airmail letters in English, because my father couldn't write English until much later in life. Actually, I think I also almost remember the track number. I think it was track 109. So that level of detail, despite my age, which is 60, actually survives because I had written it so many times. And the story that my father then told us was that he had the name of the street where his friends stayed, but he did not have the number of the close where they stayed. So he had, when he eventually arrived from Southampton, which I am assuming was by train, he got on a taxi and got the taxi driver to take him to Annette Street in Govanhill, which is a very long street either side of Allison Street, and then not having his friends' names, he had to get out into the street and just begin to shout the names until they heard him and came down and got him and took him up to their apartment. My dad moved into a rented property in the Gorbals area. He moved above the shop which my mother and her family then owned, which was a day-to-day grocery shop known as a dairy in those times in the Gorbals, which she had run from 1937 until when he first met her, which must have been around 1955. My mum's shop was called Esther's Dairy. It was very well known in the Gorbals. It had two situations. I think she had a small shop at first and then a bigger shop down in Old Rutherland Road. My mother's name was Esther Darcy. She was very religious, as were her family, but very, religious in a Catholic sense. And so when my dad first started to court her, he of course didn't speak English, and again got some friends to write down romantic song lyrics to her, and he would go down, read out the song lyrics, and the story goes, took her a boiled egg as a gift, which she thought was really funny, but there was something about that which she felt must have been done with a degree of love. So they then started to, he persisted in attempting to ask her out on dates, which eventually she did agree to, but apparently that took about 2 years because there's no doubt you can imagine it appeared to everybody on the outside it's a very unusual situation. So in the meantime, I believe my father started to sell haberdashery and other clothing door to door, mostly in the Lanarkshire area. Subsequent to that, in the early days, once my mum had shut her grocery shop, my mum and dad opened a retail shop in Rockazy in Glasgow, again selling children's clothes, haberdashery, just locally to local residents. So eventually my mum and dad got married, or wanted to get married, and her parents objected to that, to the extent that they asked the local parish priest from St Francis of Assisi, which was a massive church in Gorbals, now a community centre. They asked the priest to investigate via the Christian churches in Sahiwal whether or not my father was married, and found out that he was, or that he had been, and consequently, because of the Catholic religion, my mother and father couldn't get married in church, to my mother's great disappointment and my grandparents' great disappointment. However, they carried on, and like a lot of people at that time, got married in Martha Street Registry Office. None of the family attended. Their best man and best maid were Yaqub Ali and his wife Nancy, and who bought my mum and dad a half tea set as a present, and that, you know, was the only present they got on their wedding. And I think they went out for a meal after that. So quite kind of sad. However, you know, my mum's family did begin to form a relationship with my dad, and certainly felt quite, you know, very highly of him. Soon after my mum and dad married, they moved to Hutchison Square in the Gorbals, which is now where I believe Blackfriars Primary School stands, and had me just a year and 3 months after my brother. And from there, moved to Carfin Street in Govan Hill. It's another tenement. Earliest memories, you know, was of him singing in the house. Classic kind of 1960s attire for a handsome guy like him. You know, in the morning he would have his dhoti, but also the kind of white vest. Really handsome young guy, brill creamed hair. You know, a great kind of regime in the morning to get himself sorted out, and he would be singing all the romantic songs from the earliest films. So in the Gorbals in those days, in the 60s, and prior to that, the Jewish community had settled, and they ran many of the big businesses, haberdashery, the kind of things that people like my dad would put in their case and take around. But of course, that, as all sort of migrant communities do and areas do, it was evolving, and the Jewish community were moving out of Gorbals and out of those businesses, really. And so somebody else had to buy them up, and there appeared to be, you know, there was that phenomenon about wholesale business, which then sold bigger quantities of goods to the individual salesperson in the street or whatever. But the bigger, of course, the more volume you sell, the more profit you can get. So around about the mid-60s then, my dad and some of his friends, of course, cottoned on to this. He opened a shop, first of all, in Gorbals Cross, where the mosque now stands, exactly where the mosque now stands, and began to sell wholesale goods from there. And my brother and I, along with my mother and, you know, various other people, helped out. It had a cellar, I remember, which my brother and I used to launch ourselves off the steps into huge volumes of anoraks and jumpers. Dad was always really affable with his customers, you know, really had the personality to make them feel special. Throughout his kind of his career, you could see that he made mostly the staff feel special, but because he was generous, but also the customers. A few years into that, I think in the around about 1970, early 70s, my dad then moved across from Gorbals Cross, which, you know, he had outgrown in terms of the success, and I'm assuming financial success. I was too small to notice that, except at Christmas we seemed to get a huge upsurge in the amount of toys that we got. And he moved to Commerce Street, to a really large premises there, and quite quickly acquired the 4-storey building across the road, or certainly the top 2 tiers, I think. So in the late 60s, he acquired the most gorgeous red Jaguar saloon, stunning car, just a really beautiful car. And then subsequent to that, I had a series of Rolls Royces. My dad was doing so well that he bought a house for what I believe then, 1969, was around about £6,000, but it was a very large sandstone house in the Mansfield area of Glasgow, and we moved there as a family, and it was the most beautiful house. It was the most stunning garden, fully stocked with fruit, veg and plants and flowers. So my father had a dream, if you like, of building a huge warehouse, which was not just a great big box or, you know, fabricated out of steel or aluminium, but that was actually something that you could leave as a legacy. And he went to one of the great architectural firms in Glasgow at the time, and asked them to do some designs for him. I mean, nobody in Scotland at that time had thought of building a very modern warehouse, which would be customer friendly, purpose built in terms of, you know, stock rooms, beautiful counters, display areas. So when they first launched the wholesale business, they called it D&D Wholesale, Din after my dad's name and Darcy after my mother's name. So that's where the D&D came from. The warehouse was opened, D&D warehouse, in June 1982. My dad organised a huge opening with some Scottish celebrities, and of course you would need to have, you know, a distinction between trade customers and the kind of, you know, everyday person in the street that came in. And my brother came up with the idea of having a membership card, that people would buy a card the same as you do for Costco, and you know, so therefore civilians, if you like, could get in and buy stuff. That started a sort of publicity war in the newspapers, not only through advertising, but they became news stories, and it brought in, to my knowledge, pretty humongous profits. Although my mum and dad were very successful in business, you know, life went on in the face of discrimination. We just carried on with life. But my mum, being my mum in particular, would not let any clear sign of discrimination or hint of discrimination pass. You know, from the very youngest age, I just remember my mum being a battler for her husband and for her kids. So for instance, you know, a teacher who at the age of 5 gave me a really awful report card, and my mum knew that that wasn't the case because she saw me work hard at home. I was always doing my homework, even at a very young age. She knew right away, and, you know, would challenge that the real reason for getting a downmarked report card was racism, not because I wasn't performing at the age of 5. My dad, who I earlier mentioned, was driving quite an ostentatious Jaguar car, and he was routinely stopped and searched by the police in those days, because, you know, why would a Pakistani man have such a fancy car? So, you know, and often the police would then drive him home, moving house again away from the big house to a more manageable house. And my mum wanted a new dining set, you know, chairs, table, cabinets for the new house. So we went into Shawlands, where we always went to shop, and in those days the Co-op used to have furniture and white goods. And also in those days, and I mean that was just the late 70s, actually, you know, if as a woman you didn't have a job or you didn't have your own bank account, so you weren't allowed to sign a credit agreement. So we needed my dad to come, but of course he couldn't, you know, he had to be stuck at the warehouse, but he would come along. He says, why don't you take the kids and go to the Co-op, pick what you want, get them to write it all out, and then I'll come and sign it. So we did all of that, and my dad arrived. And as soon as my dad arrived, because I just remember my mum, myself, my brother, the guy, the Co-op man standing. My dad came in, and the guy literally ripped up the invoices. Sorry, I can't go through with the sale. And I think we all stood open mouthed. My mum's view, and I'm sure she would have then followed that up, but it would also have been, well, if that's how you feel, we wouldn't want to buy here anyway. Before the arrival of the most basic mobile phone, which, as everybody, even young people now know, was sort of the size of a brick. It was, you know, it's now a kind of comedy prop. the old phones that size. But before then, because my dad had 3 or 4 businesses in the area, and because he was really, really on the money, literally, he wanted to know, he wanted to have a running total every few hours of how much the businesses were taking in. So he had to phone each business. So he didn't go in, and the kind of more he could trust his staff, he maybe went in later in the morning, and he would sit down on the floor, and of course it's the old dial phone. So he'd pick the phone up, slowly dial the number to one shop, get the figures, have a chat about why maybe there weren't that many people in that should have been, what's happening today, the customers, put the phone down, and then he would, business number 2, the long dial. So he was on the phone all day before he went out. Well, this is one of my father's hookah, of which he had several. Must be at least 45, maybe 50 years old. And my father loved the hookah. Even when we were babies, and we had an open coal fire in Toryglen, he would light the material for his hookah pipe in there, and unfortunately, more often than not, set the chimney on fire. All the soot inside the chimney, and the fire brigade would have to come. He did it so often that my mum threatened to, because she thought it was funny, to phone the police if he ever did it again. I think he gave it up for a long time, and then when we moved into a big house with a big garden, then he could do that outside us, as way before barbecues or anything. But so he built, or he asked somebody to build for him just an assembly of bricks, and I was dutifully sent out, as a teenager, every evening of every night, all year, cold, wet, doesn't matter what it was, to burn the cardboard, which then, would burn his tobacco, or, to clean out the pipe and put water in the base. And we used to have to undo a wire clothes hanger, and, put it down there. It's like a big pipe cleaner, but it was never good enough. But that was a real bond between me and my dad, because, I was proud of keeping his pipe going when he'd come in at 11 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night, but, it was not an easy task. That was his own little piece of Pakistan, which he never gave up, never ever gave up.